Welcome to the Portico podcast, a show that explores the landscape of private markets in Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. This is Mike Casey, the founder of Portico Advisors LLC and your host. When I decided to launch the podcast, I wanted today's interviewee, Roger Leeds, to be one of the first guests, and I wanted to explore the theme of private equity and its role in private sector development in emerging and frontier markets. A bit of background may be helpful here. So 15 years ago or so, I was working for the Department of Defense on strategies to address a variety of intractable issues. For one such issue, I was the youngest member of an interagency team working with senior civilian and military commanders in Baghdad and Kabul on the thorny issue of Interior Ministry and police reform. U.S. policymakers had dubbed 2006 the quote-unquote year of police. But as that year passed by, the results trickled in, and I was growing increasingly skeptical about the ability of the United States to effect positive and enduring change in Iraq and Afghanistan. And moreover, when viewed in a broader perspective of state building, counterterrorism, and U.S. national security objectives, I became convinced that the only viable long-term solution was to drive investment into the region, create jobs, and over time, generate licit opportunities for people to feed their families. So it was off to grad school, where I wanted to study economics and finance, and where I serendipitously learned about something called private equity and how it could actually drive private sector development in emerging markets. Roger Leeds taught that course, and he's had a profound influence on me, not only when I was a student at the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies, or SICE, but also in the positive influence that's endorsed to this day. So a brief thumbnail sketch on Roger. Roger worked as an international financier for 25 years before joining the faculty at SICE. After working as an investment banker at Salomon Brothers, Roger was at the forefront of the development of the emerging market private equity industry, not only as a senior staff member at the International Finance Corporation, but also as a private equity investor and as the co-founder of the Emerging Markets Private Equity Association, or MPIA. Roger is the author of Private Equity Investing in Emerging Markets, Opportunities for Value Creation, the seminal book on the topic, which I encourage every listener to pick up and read. In our discussion today, we talk about the structural drivers that make private equity a useful investment strategy in emerging markets, and how it is qualitatively different than the leveraged buyout model that is prevalent in the United States and Western Europe. We also talk about the hollowing out of MidMarket PE funds in emerging markets and why it's a problem. We talk about the story of local currency PE funds in China and his work with Francis Fukuyama on the Leadership Academy for Development, among several other things. I hope you enjoy our conversation. All right, Roger. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I'm excited to have you as one of the first guests on the show. I don't know if I've ever told you this, but you had a profound influence on me when I was a student of yours at SICE a dozen years ago now. And Portico certainly wouldn't exist if you hadn't inculcated a passion for the potential that private equity can play when it's done well in developing countries in terms of its role in private sector development. So thank you for being a positive and enduring influence on me all those years ago in the Rome building.
Well, thanks for saying that, Mike. I really appreciate it. I do have that passion, and I want to thank you for having me on, and I congratulate you on what you've done so far with Portico, and I wish you all the best going forward. It's a very important contribution you're making to the industry. And I wish you well as you continue to develop your initiative. So well done.
Well, thank you very much. Let's start out in the early days. You were present at the creation of emerging markets private equity in a way. And what was the rationale behind bringing this form of investment to emerging markets?
Rationale, I thought at the time, and I still think, although it's not developed as I thought it would exactly, was very compelling in a couple of ways. One is there was indisputably a huge financing gap for private companies in developing countries, and that financing gap was not so much because there was an inadequate supply of capital in those countries, but the financial markets and financial institutions were not being very responsive. Financial markets in virtually every developing countries are markedly inefficient in terms of how they allocate capital, and very little capital gets to the private sector, and even less gets to high growth companies in the private sector. And so that is a huge structural problem in developing countries that was present then when we started, and it's still frankly present in most countries today. And that creates an opportunity to bridge that financing gap for selective companies. Companies, the PE people, as you know, are highly rigorous in their due diligence, and they're very discriminating in what type of companies they invest in. But there was a huge market out there, regardless of the country, of companies that were suffering from a lack of medium and long-term capital. And I stress medium and long-term, not short-term capital. And so private equity had the potential to bridge that gap for selective companies. The second thing was that there were a lot of companies, particularly middle market companies, and I use that term very broadly, that were growing in the private domain very well up to a certain point. The private sector was growing in many of these countries, and a lot of these companies were doing very, very well, but they would hit a wall. They hit a wall after a certain level of growth, not only because they lacked the medium and long-term capital, but it required a new skill set that they didn't really have to build their companies, become more competitive and profitable over time. And I think that that's the other somewhat underappreciated aspect of private equity in developing countries, which is the value creation. And this is one of the things that distinguishes, I think, private equity investing in developing countries versus the West, which is that the real work of the private equity investor in a developing country begins after they write the check and start working with the entrepreneur to build value over a period of time. So those were the original rationale. I think they were compelling. And I think to a large extent, for many countries and companies, those rationales still exist. The other one I would mention, particularly in contrast to developed countries in the West, is there were no debt markets. So this was going to be a pure equity play for the most part. Private companies in developing countries then, and to a large extent today, do not have access to medium-term credit. And so the equity play made a lot of sense in the absence of credit. And most PE back in the day was not leveraged, which really separated it from what was happening in the West. And even today, there's very, very little leverage buyout activity in developing countries because there are no credit markets that make sense for these companies.
But I guess I'm wondering, what were some of the challenges that differentiated private equity in developing countries from how it was practiced in the United States?
If you go back to the very beginning, and actually it goes back to the 1990s, not the 2000s, the first generation of PE funds performed very poorly in developing countries. They just didn't live up to their promise. And my view is that one of the principal reasons for that was that the industry, which was very, very small at the time, as you know, was comprised primarily of Westerners, white guys like you and me, who lived in New York or Washington or Miami, and would fly down to these countries and do their due diligence and so forth, and come home on the weekends to their spouse and family. There was very little local presence, number one, which I think was one of the explanations. They weren't there 24/7. And the other was there was very little in the way of indigenous human capital in the industry. So almost everyone was Western, predominantly American. Many of them didn't speak the languages. They didn't have very much connection to the business culture in their countries. And there was a disconnect, and it was reflected in very poor financial performance of the first generation of funds. They didn't perform well, and I think those are two of the reasons. The other, of course, is it was a pioneering industry back in the day. And so there was a huge learning curve. But over time, I think that the two things I just mentioned changed. And that was one of the reasons why the industry began to gradually take off, which is to say that more and more funds recognized that they had to be in those countries 24/7. And over time, and this is one of the encouraging things that's happened, there did develop a core human capital in these countries, individuals that were world-class professionals that were from these countries, that understood the countries. And over time, gradually, you had less Western personnel and more local personnel running these funds. And this was very, very important.
This gets to the role of the development finance institutions. And once upon a time, they institutions such as IFC or CDC Group in the UK viewed their role as helping to build local fund managers and franchises that would help to bridge this financing gap and facilitate private sector growth. Do you think private equity has lived up to its potential in meeting those needs that were the rationale for the creation of EMPE in the first place?
The answer is yes and no. You may not like that answer, but let me remind you and whoever's listening that IFC, which I know much the best because I worked there for over a decade in the 1980s, IFC was the first private equity investor in developing countries. It was the first development finance institution to make equity investments in private companies in developing countries going back to the 50s and into the 60s. This was before private equity. But in essence, even in the early days of IFC, it was effectively private equity because they would make these equity investments with the expectation that over time they would exit with a respectable financial return. It was not private equity in the sense that they did not have much of a hands-on role in these companies. So in that sense, it wasn't private equity. But they were the first real equity investors in private companies in developing countries. And then later on, as you just said, they started to become more actively involved in developing private equity funds in developing countries, primarily as a LP. They also were doing direct investing, equity investing in individual companies, but let's leave that aside for a moment. When IFC began to see its role as catalytic in developing the private equity industry in these countries, its role as an LP in those early years, now I'm talking about the 2000s, the early and mid 2000s, it was very effective. And I saw this firsthand when I was writing about this and interviewing people all over the developing countries, that IFC would come in as an LP and it did create additionality. When IFC decided that it was going to be an LP in a first generation fund in a developing country, it did attract other investors, whether they were other DFCs, like CDC, as you said, or private investors. I think it was very important, very instrumental in growing the industry during this period. More recently, where I'm not as familiar, but I don't think it's been playing that role as aggressively, which is a disappointment. But I think that the IFC and the other DFCs are critically important because there's really not a sufficient amount of private capital going into, especially the middle market in these countries. And so I think it does have a catalytic role to play.
But I'd love to pick up on this evaporation of mid-market PE funds in emerging markets. And I pulled some data points so that listeners could know what we're talking about here. But if you go back to 2008, 53 mid-market PE funds, in which I'm just defining these as between $100 million and $500 million in size, they raised about $12 billion and accounted for 30% of the number of funds and 21% of the capital raised. But you fast forward to last year, and only 27 mid-market PE funds raised $7.5 billion. So there's half as many mid-market PE funds achieving a close, and not quite half, but a little bit more than half of the capital, right? And that number of funds was only 14% of the funds that were raised and only 9% of the capital. So there has been a complete hollowing out of mid-market funds. So What do you see going on here, and why is the decline of mid-market funds a problem?
I would say this is my biggest disappointment in looking at what's happened to the industry over the last 20 years. I think that there are a range of reasons, but one of them is that the risk aversion starts with the LP community, the Western LPs that would prefer, for a variety of reasons, to write fewer, larger checks to well-established uh, name PE funds, mainly international funds. It's easier for them. They have to do less due diligence, and the downside is much less. And so they would rather generate lower returns, in my view, and take less risk by going with the larger funds. And we see this over and over again. So it starts with the LP community, which has become increasingly risk averse, arguably for understandable reasons. And then, of course, if you're writing fewer checks to larger funds, those funds that receive that money have to write larger checks. And so you find, as your data suggests, that PE fund managers are making larger and larger investments at the top of what we would call the private sector pyramid, where the deal flow is less. And so I think this is an unsustainable trend, and we're already seeing that the financial returns at the top of the private sector pyramid, namely investments in very large companies in developing countries, have been less like traditional PE financial returns, lower than financial returns we'd expected. And the LPs seem to be content with this. So they're not generating PE returns, but they're taking less risk. And the PE funds that are doing this investing, if you were raising a $500 or $1 billion fund, you simply have to look for very, very large companies to invest in. Those companies, I would add, that are less in need of the PE investment than the middle market companies. So across the board, I think it's a huge problem. It's been a disappointment to me personally. When I go back over the last 20 years, I would not have expected this to happen. And I think it doesn't bode well for the industry. And I would argue that it's unsustainable. And I'll give you a specific example. In Africa, we went through a period over the last few years where a few of the very, very largest Pan-African funds attracted huge amounts of LP investments, multi-billion-dollar funds, a handful, by the way, just a small number of Pan-African funds that were multi-billion in size. And that trend was not sustainable because there simply are not enough large companies in Africa to absorb that kind of capital. And as you know probably better than I do, there has been a shrinking of the number of large Pan-African funds in Africa, and the returns have been abysmal.
That they have. Yeah, I remember being in Lagos, Nigeria, back when the frenzy was just reaching its apex, and I was speaking with some folks from the DFIs who shall remain nameless. But the writing was on the wall even while the champagne was being poured in the ballrooms. That this was an equation that made no sense. That there was too much capital coming into the top of the pyramid, and there was no way that it could be deployed well and returned to investors. And it was just as commercial investors were coming into the market in size.
It's the herd effect, isn't it? Yeah, the herd effect all through finance, which is very prominent. But let me mention something else, Mike, that I think is very important, which we have not discussed, which is that if you look back until, say, 2015, in the early days of PE in emerging markets, it was all US dollar investing. There was virtually no local currency private equity. And this, of course, also doesn't make sense in the larger scheme of things, because, of course, you're taking a huge foreign exchange risk in addition to all the other risks that you layer on top of that. But that was the industry. And then something happened in around 2015, 16, I don't remember the exact date, and it was China. And China really bent the curve. Up until that time, virtually all the investment in China, as with other countries, was US dollar investment. And then the government took the initiative to encourage, through a variety of public policy initiatives, local currency financing. And you can criticize what they did and how they did it, but overnight, in a matter of 1 or 2 years, there was a sharp decline in US dollar investing in private equity in China, and a huge spike, probably too quick a spike, in local currency financing. And it changed the whole nature of the industry. Some would argue that it was overdone and that there were some problems with that, but they did recognize the importance of developing a local currency private equity industry. And I give them a lot of credit for that, notwithstanding the problems with implementation. I think other countries began to take notice with that, but China had a macroeconomic environment that was more conducive to this than most other countries. Namely, it controlled interest rates. Take Brazil. As long as interest rates are very high, real interest rates are very high, as in Brazil and most other developing countries, there's very little incentive for local investors to take the risks inherent in private equity. But we have seen a number of governments that have started to recognize the value of local currency private equity, and beginning to initiate policy reforms that will encourage local institutional investors to allocate some of their capital to the private equity asset class. And I think this is very encouraging. I hope over time it will increase. And I think it would make a lot of sense if dollar investing in these countries were to diminish relative to local currency over time.
Sticking with this idea of local capacity development, for the last, I don't know how long it's been, 5 to 10 years, you've been working with Francis Fukuyama on the Leadership Academy for Development. What was the impetus for creating this program? What is it, and what has it taught you about private sector development after all of your years building a career in this space?
Well, Frank and I started this over 10 years ago. Frank and I wanted to create a program that would, and we have, that would focus on bringing together not the highest level public officials, but mid and senior level public officials in various developing countries, and put them in a room with private investors and private entrepreneurs, so that they would learn from one another about what it takes to promote private sector growth in these countries, what public policy reforms were necessary, how to combat corruption, how to encourage public-private partnerships, and how to do private equity. And we believe that it required a sensitivity in government and in the public sector to what it takes to encourage higher levels of responsible private investment. And so what we started with was just an idea, was to build human capital capacity in these countries. It's been a very gratifying experience. We've done these programs now in over 50 different countries. I should say that we've not taken a penny from the development finance institutions, so we're totally independent. We develop our own curriculum, our own cases, and it's been a lot of fun, very gratifying.
Excellent. I guess, what have you learned from the participants in those classes that perhaps you hadn't learned before?
I have become much more sensitive and appreciative of the huge obstacles that professional civil servants have to bring about change in their countries. The levels of corruption, the level of political interference are just mind-boggling. And this is a common denominator virtually everywhere we work. And I've also become more impressed and appreciative of the caliber of the people we work with. These are honest, highly driven, and motivated public servants who are trying to make their countries function better, almost to the last one that I've met. And they're very dedicated to what they're doing. The obstacles they encounter are basically at the political level. Sounds familiar looking at this country, but the political impediments are just huge. Political interference, different stakeholders who have different agendas. We spend a lot of time in our programs talking about assessing stakeholder interests and how you reconcile different stakeholders and to get results. And so it's been an enormously rewarding and educational experience for me. Can't say enough about it.
Excellent. All right, well, let's turn to our rapid fire closing questions. Given that you've had an enduring influence on me from when I sat in your classroom, I'm curious, who has had an enduring influence on you, whether it be, professional, personal, however you so choose?
Well, when I think about that question, I wish I could think of more individuals who have influenced me from the private sector, but that's a struggle. Most of the people who have really impacted me have been people from the public sector or academia. One of my mentors was a guy who you and most have never heard of, but is Robert Osgood, who was a dean of SAIS and who supervised my PhD, and was somewhat of a father figure for me. And he wrote a book, a seminal book that I still think is relevant, called back in the, I guess in the 60s or 70s, called Ideals and Self-Interest. And it still is one of the great books about American foreign policy and how you reconcile a country's ideals and self-interest. And we're still struggling with that 30 or 40 years later. So he was really important in my intellectual development, and he was a good friend, and he, as I said, almost a father figure to me. I've enjoyed working with Frank Fukuyama. We've developed an enormously close working relationship over the last 15 or 20 years. And reading his books over that time has been awe-inspiring. And I've learned a lot from him about things that have nothing to do with private equity or the private sector. And I've enjoyed working with him, and we've had a great working relationship over that time. Those are two people. I struggle, though, to think about, ironically, people in the private sector who have significantly impacted and influenced my career.
All right, you mentioned Robert Osgood's book. What's the best thing you've read in the last year?
That's also a tough question. I don't read much nonfiction these days. I'll tell you what I'm reading right now is sort of influenced a little bit by the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm just in the final pages of Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin. For a lighter reading, there's a Black author who writes a great series of detective stories called Walter Mosley. I've been reading him. I read Le Carré's most recent book, An Agent Running in the Field. I read Tale of Two Cities again a couple of months ago. I'm not sure why I picked it up, but I do gravitate towards the classics, and I'll tell you why. I feel that most people, when they go through high school and college, are forced to read books which they don't, or they read very superficially, and I'm certainly guilty of that. And so I've come back to a lot of the books I may have read as required reading in college and high school that I didn't understand. And so Dickens, George Eliot, Tolstoy. Over the last 2 or 3 years, I've really enjoyed reading books that I didn't appreciate when I was younger and now appreciate a lot more.
Amen to that. All right, so you've traveled probably to more places than anyone else I've ever met. So where has been your favorite place to travel when you wanted to cut loose and get away?
I'm not sure I would say favorite, but the most interesting. By the way, the last count was over 140 countries. I'm not sure how many it is, but I have done a lot over the years. I've been blessed with my jobs to spend a huge amount of time in the developing world. The two countries that stand out for me, one is Brazil, because I started my life in Brazil as a Peace Corps volunteer, living in Mato Grosso, deep in the interior of Brazil in the 1960s. And it had a profound impact on me. And I've gone back to Brazil dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of times. And I love the country, even though it's a mess. The joke from way back when was that Brazil is the country of the future and always will be. It has huge potential, which has never been realized politically or economically, and it's still true today. So, but I love Brazil and I love going there, and I have a lot of friends there, and it's sort of in my blood. I speak the language, and it's just a wonderful place, even though it's been continuously volatile and I would say a mess, disappointing. And the other is China. Um, I've been going, my first trip to China was as a graduate student, and I was one of the very first American students to go to China. I went there the first time the year Mao Zedong died in 1976, and I've been going back periodically ever since in various capacities. And as everyone knows, it's an extraordinary story. Regardless of what you think about China today, what it has achieved in terms of development is so far beyond comparison with any other developing country, is just awe-inspiring. And there are lots of explanations for it, but the bottom line is that they have lifted hundreds and hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and no other country, no other developing country comes even close to matching their performance. When I started first going to China, it was the poorest country in the world. And I don't have to tell you where it is today. And if you compare it, for example, to Brazil, the other country I mentioned, it's just staggering what China has accomplished relative to a country like Brazil or many, many other countries. So I've been impressed by it. I don't understand China, but every time I go, I learn something. I find it intriguing. I think it challenges just about everything Western textbooks tell you about development. And notwithstanding all the issues we have with China today, and I don't want to be a defender of the political system of China, I'm just very intrigued by what they've achieved over these last 30 or 40 years. And I think there's a lot to learn from it. And I have learned enormously from going there and being with Chinese officials over this period of time.
All right. And this question is one that I'm sure you get a lot, but what advice would you give to a young person who's keen to build a career either as an investor or as an entrepreneur in emerging markets?
Oh, I'll go back to what I just said parenthetically about my early days as a Peace Corps volunteer. I don't think you can really be effective in developing countries unless you have spent a reasonably long period of time on the ground at the grassroots level, speaking the language, learning the culture. And I don't think enough people do that today. It's not just about Peace Corps, it's about doing anything. And over the years, I've talked to lots of my students at SAIS who are very genuinely and deeply interested in development. But when you say, well, then go live in one of these countries for a couple of years, do whatever you want. They say, well, that's an awful lot of time, and I'm not sure I want to do that. And I think that's a big mistake. You have to be on the ground, living the problems in these countries on a day-to-day basis to really appreciate how difficult it is to be successful in these environments. The other thing I would say has to do with my experience at SAIS and at IFC. IFC, even today, I think mistakenly, only recruits predominantly for investment officers people with an MBA, and I think that's a huge mistake. I think they should be much more eclectic in their recruitment strategy. I think an MBA is a useful degree, but I would say, especially at a place like IFC, it's really overvalued, and that knowing more than how to do a discounted cash flow analysis is important for being successful in these countries, particularly in private equity. So if you look at the private equity investment cycle, only a small part of it has to do with finance and financial analysis and valuation. I think that skill set is very, very important, but it's the tip of the iceberg. And to be a successful professional in these countries, you have to know more than finance. And I think that most of the funds and places like IFC put too high a premium on that relatively narrow skill set that is taught in MBA programs. And I have taught in MBA programs, as you know, at Wharton and Columbia. So I know from where I speak.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again for coming on the show, Roger. This has been delightful.
Well, always good to talk to you, Mike. And I, again, congratulate you on what you've set out to do. I think it's a great initiative. And I hope you continue with it and it continues to be successful and you build your listeners base.
Hear, hear. Hi, everyone. This is Mike again. Thank you for listening. I hope you found the conversation edifying. And if you have any feedback, whether it's good or bad, please send me an email at mike@porticoadvisors.com. If you're keen to learn more about private markets developments across the emerging markets, then smash that subscribe button on your podcast player and please visit our website, porticoadvisors.com. That's porticoadvisers.com, where you can peruse our research and newsletter archives and sign up for our monthly-ish newsletter. If you like this episode, my only wish is that you please share it with a friend, colleague, or your connections on social media. Sharing is caring. Thanks in advance, and ciao for now. The discussion in this podcast is for informational purposes only. Neither Portico Advisors LLC nor its guests plan to update this material, and the opinions and conclusions mentioned may change without notice. Neither Portico Advisors LLC nor its guests make any warranty that the information in this podcast is error-free, omission-free, complete, accurate, or reliable. Nothing contained in this podcast should be construed as legal, tax, securities, or investment advice.